Psychiatrist debunks the left brain, right brain myth. The headline proclaims, always interested to learn more. I read on, only to discover that the psychiatrist in question is myself. This puts his finger on the nub of the matter. I don't believe in the left brain, right brain myth. I believe in discovering the truth about hemisphere difference. There can be no question that it would be foolish to believe most of what has passed into popular culture on the topic of hemisphere differences. And yet it would be just as foolish to believe that therefore there are no important hemisphere differences. There are massively important ones which lie at the core of what it means to be a human being. It is that we have been barking up the wrong tree. When people object that each hemisphere is involved in everything we do, they are right. When they assume that means there are no differences, they are wrong. It is not what each hemisphere does, but how it does what matters. Each hemisphere is involved in everything, true enough, just in a quite different way. I was hoping that you might find the thesis of this truly interesting. I even hope that they might feel inspired to take the ideas further, but I anticipate that otherwise it will be largely ignored. Partly this is because of its topic. My colleagues and mentors in the world of psychiatry and neurology had, from the very outset, some 30 years ago, counseled me against getting involved in laterality research since it was stigmatized within the neuroscience world due to its appropriation by pop psychology. They also warned me correctly that it would involve going back to the drawing board. All the things we thought we knew about hemisphere difference had been shown, one by one, to be either wrong or at best half-truths. That had led in somewhat defeatist fashion, I have to say, to its being given up as a bad job, and those who gave up reconciled themselves to the lost time and effort by proclaiming loudly their own myth, that there are no significant hemisphere differences. I knew enough, however, to realize that there were fascinating intellectual puzzles here that were simple and too important to neglect, whatever the cost in terms of career. They demanded further investigation. For example, every known creature with a neuronal system, however far down the evolutionary tree one goes and however far back in time, has a system that is asymmetrical. Why on earth would that be, given that the world they are interacting with is not asymmetrical? I was already involved in neuroimaging research on the loss of normal brain asymmetry in schizophrenia that was clearly bearing fruit, so I could not help seeing the topic as potentially of some significance. When after 20 years of research, I arrived at the point of publication of this, I believed I would face a hostile establishment. With few exceptions, that has not been the case, and thankfully some of the best-known names in neuroscience are on record as engaging seriously with this thesis. I also expected, of course, the usual faction of self-appointed myth debunkers who would feel comfortably one-up on the gullible masses by professing that there was nothing in it without the bore of acquainting themselves with the evidence before pronouncing. I imagine that there have been plenty of those, but that is neither here nor there. The other reason I did not expect this to be widely read was because it is, I admit, demanding. I took pains to write it as clearly as I could without, I hope, ever talking down to my audience instead of meeting them on a level footing to get to grips with issues in neuroscience and philosophy. Though without presuming any prior knowledge, I aimed to explain what I saw in terms that any interested non-specialist reader would be able to understand. But neuropsychology and phenomenological philosophy probably are not everyone's idea of an easy read. 10 years on, I have been generally astonished by the completely unforeseen extent to which this thesis has been taken up by people in every discipline and from every walk of life. It has already sold over 100,000 copies and has readers all over the world. I think the reason for this must be that the structural and functional differences between the brain hemispheres, which I describe, have, as indeed they must, their correlates in the mind, and that we are intuitively aware of these structural and functional differences within our consciousness, but only, it seems, once they are pointed out. One of the most common reactions has been, "You articulated ideas that I knew to be true, but for which I had never found words. You told me something that was immediately compelling because I was at some level already aware of the patterns you were revealing and the associations you were making." This cannot be due to such readers simply being familiar with the popular left brain, right brain story, because the picture that emerges from this is quite different from anything they would have come across previously. and it cannot be simply because there are philosophical distinctions here with which they were already familiar, regardless of any brain correlates, because this pattern of difference is not the same as those found in any conventional philosophical debate. Though parts of it certainly have their reflections at different points in the history of ideas, the theme of the second half of the text. Just how different this picture is from the familiar left brain, right brain story can be judged from the simplest of observations. It is, for instance, just not true that the left hemisphere is unemotional, perhaps a bit boring, but at least down to earth and reliable. In fact, the left hemisphere is more likely than the right to get angry or dismissive, jump to conclusions, become deluded, or get stuck in denial. Equally, it is not true that the right hemisphere has no language. It usually has no speech, which is a different matter. It understands many of the subtlest and most important elements of language better than the left. Nor is it true that the left hemisphere cannot deal with visual imagery. In certain respects, it very clearly can. Maths and science are not primarily dependent on the left hemisphere, but draw in different respects on both of the hemispheres. And no, the left brain is not male, nor is the right brain female. The hemisphere hypothesis transcends and replaces, and is not a perpetuation of the old dichotomies, reason versus feeling, rationality versus intuition, system 1 versus system 2, male brain versus female brain. Each hemisphere plays its part on either side of each of those dichotomies. Trawl the interest and you'll find all kinds of misinformation. Some of it is on popular teach-yourself psychology websites, some on the websites of management gurus. One of my favorites is this list, a slide I sometimes use in lectures with the health warning in the title, right and wrong. And so, left brain functions, uses logic, detail-oriented, facts, rule, words and language, present and past, math and science, can comprehend, knowing, acknowledges, sees, order and pattern, knows object, name, reality-based forms, strategies, and practical, and is safe. Right brain functions, it uses feeling, big picture-oriented imagination, rules, symbols and images, present and future, philosophy and religion, can get it, believes, appreciates, spatial perception, knows object function, fantasy-based, presents possibilities, impetuous, and risk-taking. And although there's nothing unusual here, and it is actually one of the most nuanced such summaries on the web, the nuances do not help because they are wrong. There's only one pairing here that is broadly correct. All the others are false, sometimes so badly that they represent the inverse of what is known to be the case. And as for conventional philosophical debate, just how different the thesis of this is, taken as a whole from many existing patterns, can be gauged from the fact that no one, to my knowledge, has ever seen, let alone forged, a philosophical position on the basis of the commonalities between, for example, realism, the appreciation of uniqueness, music and time, a sense of humor, a capacity for reading body language, sustaining attention in the flight or fight mode, or between unreasonable optimism, manipulation, disembodiment, literalism, and preoccupations with detail, theory, and body parts. Put like that, they sound improbably random assortments of characteristics, not corresponding to any pre-existing philosophical worldviews. Yet, after reading, and once the bigger picture is painted, the reader will, I hope, see exactly how these elements go to form a coherent picture, one that falls into two coherent parts, a picture that also illuminates our situation here in the West today, as those who have read seem readily to understand. This suggests to me that since the patterns that emerge from the neuroscience behind this thesis seem familiar to readers, they can do so for one reason only, namely that they can correspond to intuitions that the human mind has about its own way of working and its consequent structuring of reality. Nor are the elements ones that I would or could have come up with according to any preconceived theory of my own that I might have read. They simply came of immersing myself for 20 years in the field and its literature and pondering what emerged in order to see the pattern I needed to take in the broadest range of material available. In order to examine and substantiate the detail, I needed to look closely at myriad discrete findings. The sheer variety of people who have responded to and taken up my ideas also helps, at least in my own mind, to support the thesis that the world is structured according to hemisphere differences, since, if I am right, it ought to apply to human experience across the board. So, as well as many positive responses from the world of neurology, psychiatry, psychology, and philosophy, I have had enthusiastic responses from some areas which initially surprised me, only in the sense that I know relatively little about them, such as the worlds of economics, finance, and law, and I have been delighted but less surprised by warm responses from artists, musicians, and therapists, and from the world of teachers, priests, and doctors. Occasionally, people who ought to know better make sweepingly dismissive pronouncements on the whole topic of hemisphere difference. What they are attacking, however, when one looks more closely, are what they themselves describe as caricatures, popular beliefs, and so on. After one such gleeful romp, the authors accept that the left and right halves of the brain do function in some different ways, but these differences are more subtle than it's popularly believed. For example, the left side processes small details of things you see. The right processes the overall shape. And yes, indeed, but should subtle mean unimportant? Indeed, why would processing small details of things versus processing the overall shape not have a whole raft of consequences? And of course it does. The quote, by the way, comes from publicity surrounding a book called Top Brain, Bottom Brain, which involved a number of caricatures of its own, so one can understand the drive to get the inconvenient hemisphere story out of the way. Hence the scope of this book. The real story of hemisphere difference is indeed subtle and a complex one, but it is one that is entirely coherent. I am confident that claims that there is little difference between the hemispheres will soon appear not just dated and out of touch, but quite simply untenable. In the last decade, there has been a plethora of findings that further substantiate the hemisphere hypothesis, some of it in areas where there were only hints at the time of this book and when it was written. The growth of such literature is gratifying, and it is impossible to ignore. More studies are now reporting results in terms of lateralization, so awareness is increasing, though it is certainly or could increase further and faster with advantage. Some kinds of research can be misleading for a range of reasons. As one research team reflects, neuroimaging studies may especially fail to shed light on hemispheric lateralization. And that is because they may fail to find real differences by not adequately discriminating or by aggregating data in certain ways. But a coherent body of some 5,000 independent pieces of research that I am now aware of does shed light on hemispheric lateralization in such a way as to support the hypothesis advanced in this thesis. One development over the 10 years since publication has been an increasing respect for the capacities of the right hemisphere. It is no longer treated as having cognitive skills vastly inferior to those of a chimpanzee, as one of the giants in the field, Michael Gazzaniga, once put it. In fact, recent research from Gazzaniga's own lab shows it to be one more reliable and insightful partner, and another recent study, collating the areas of damage associated with a drop in intelligence quotient following a stroke, showed them to be almost entirely in the right hemisphere of the brain. I do not want it to be possible, after reading this book, for any intelligent person ever again to see the right hemisphere as the mirror, or the minor hemisphere, as it used to be called, still worse, the flighty, impetuous, fantastical one, the unreliable but perhaps fluffy and cuddly one, and the left hemisphere as the solid, dependable, down-to-earth hemisphere, the one that does all the heavy lifting and is alone the intelligent source of our understanding. I might still be, to some extent, swimming against the curve, but there are signs that the current may be changing direction. There are a number of points that I would wish to have made more clearly in this text had I been aware of the time of writing of the potential for misconception, and let me address them briefly now. I do not mean to suggest that the brain causes human experience. Clearly, there is a correlation between the brain and human experience. A discussion of what we can know of the nature of that correlation would take me too far from the purposes of this. However, my position in brief is that the nature and structure of the brain must be reciprocally related to the nature and structure of consciousness. It does not necessarily give rise to it, rather than, say, transduce it. It might, or it might not. I also did not mean to imply that the changes in cultural balance were due to there having been gross changes in our brains over the time periods in question, the last 2,500 years in historical time. And given that we are evolving creatures in prehistoric time, it is bound to be true that our brains have changed at some level, since our brains both mold and are in turn molded by the culture in which we live. But that is not my point. What I suggest is that nowadays we use or draw on the potential of our brains differently from the way in which we have used them at different periods in the past, periods which also differ from one another in this same respect. An analogy might be this. For a considerable while, I might find myself listening to a selection of radio stations. If with time I find I am listening to one radio station only, that does not imply my having a new radio set, just that I am using the options made possible by the existing set in a more limited way. Nor do I suggest that the causes of such cultural shifts can be reduced to neuroscience. There are many causative factors in play when cultures change, including sociological, psychological, environmental, epigenetic, technological, economic, and political factors, as well as historical, and all of which are interconnected. And in causal nexus, one can privilege one over the rest if one wishes to do so, and interpret the changes in one way or another. However, I am not attempting to answer the question of what causes changes, just of what patterns are discernible when such changes occur, and how those patterns relate to the possible takes on the world afforded to us by the brain's bihemispheric structure. Doing so gives us insight into those situations. I believe we are in one now, where the balance is lost. It helps us see what it is we are missing. An argument sometimes brought against the existence of hemisphere difference is that under normal circumstances, each hemisphere is always active to some extent. This seems to me scarcely an argument at all. No one could dispute the fact for an instant. It does not, however, prove that the two hemispheres and their roles are the same. Both the scrub nurse and the surgeon are important members of the surgical team and work together at the same time on the same task. An operation becomes hazardous in the absence of one and impossible in the absence of the other. They work well together, not because they have the same role, but precisely because they have different roles. Naturally, a hemisphere is not an undifferentiated whole, but encompasses many regions of interest. There is a lot of detail about localization, and often for simplicity's sake, for those who wish to know more. And differences between frontal and posterior cortex, as I point out, are particularly important. But equally, we now realize we need to think much more in terms of widely distributed networks, rather than, as we used to do, primarily in terms of modules. The hemispheres are vastly more connected within themselves than they are connected to one another, though, of course, interhemispheric information transfer is still important. Each hemisphere forms a complex system, and all parts of each hemisphere are prolifically interconnected so that a change in a part can alter the whole. The greatest division in the brain is that between the two hemispheric systems, which leads to their capacity for relatively independent function. So, as in life, we need both to focus on detail and yet see the whole. I do say clearly in this thesis that differences between hemispheres are not absolute, but since I have been misunderstood on this point, perhaps I should emphasize it again. Very few differences are ever absolute, especially in the living world. There is overlap, but that does nothing to undermine the essential difference. On that point, I find the example of Indonesia and Iceland very helpful, two countries that are indeed very different from one another in a host of ways, many of which can be linked in part to differences of temperature. Yet, it is still true that the warmest annual temperature recorded in Iceland is higher than the lowest annual temperature recorded in Indonesia. There is, in other words, overlap. We should not expect absolute differences in order for the differences to be substantial, even dramatic, as in the case of those two countries. A couple of related points are worth making. I have heard it said that the hemispheres are more like than they are unlike. It is hard to know exactly what this phrase means, but whatever it means, sometimes in life it is the differences that count. Donald J. Trump and Albert Einstein are undoubtedly more alike than they are unalike. An old Banger and a new Ferrari are both cars with internal combustion engines and are, in that sense, much more alike than not. But when I am buying one, I am interested in their differences. Nor am I dichotomizing. Nature got there before me, beginning with a remarkable physical division at the core of the brain, which she has since made more robust through mechanisms of interhemispheric inhibition. Some dichotomies are valid, such as those between plants and animals, despite there being, at the microscopic level, some overlap. Others, between, say, good and bad drivers, are not that it is not a true dichotomy, just a continuous spectrum. Recognizing valid differences between two elements of a system is not to dichotomize. Some people fear dichotomies are simplistic, but it is also simplistic to reject a perfectly valid dichotomy just because you happen to have a thing against dichotomies when they occur. It has been commented that the hemispheres work in the same way, referring to neural pathways, but this is to neglect phenomenological experience. The visual systems of the cat and the mouse are highly similar, but each see the world in a different way. Thus, the visual pathways of each human brain hemisphere are technically similar, though their vision of the world phenomenologically is not. There are significant differences between Fox News and others news networks, but if we focus on the mechanics of studio lighting, cabling, cameras, TV signal transmission, cathode ray tubes, plasma LED screens, etc., we're looking in the wrong place. We will find no differences and solemnly conclude that there are none, wrongly. Finally, some people feel that I have gone well beyond the facts, that I have somehow simply gone too far. Whether I have taken things too far depends on many things, including the extent of the various hemisphere differences, whether there is any pattern or overall meaning to those differences, and the context in which you view them. If you don't know the extent of the differences, and very few people do, and if at the same time you can't see the overall picture, viewing the differences as just so much lab data, not something with significance for what it means to be a living person, then yes, it's been taken too far. If you do know, however, the extent, then it is scarcely far enough. My experience has been that where this objection has been made, the problem lies in my having dared to link brain science with the history of ideas. And of course, this may simply express a discomfort felt by too many scientists as straying into the realms of philosophy and the humanities and cultural history, but until about 7 years ago, scientists would have been educated in and seen science as a part of a whole world picture in which it played just one part. It would have seemed obviously distorted to them to view science in isolation from the rest of human endeavor. In any case, when science is dealing with how consciousness brings the experience world into being, it is simply not possible to avoid philosophy, including the history of cultures and the history of ideas, and they must be an important part of the picture. And so, for much of the use that I have made of the data I have presented. But there is a further legitimate concern to be addressed: the extent and representativeness of the data themselves. It has been said by one or two critics that I must have cherry-picked the data, in other words, ignored or passed over data that do not suit my argument or my thesis. And this is not an unreasonable suspicion to have when confronting any large work that presents a coherent overall picture. It is also the easiest thing to say and the hardest of things to counter, since it cannot be disproved. The only response must be, all right, you look at the same extent of evidence that I did, and show me where you think I have cherry-picked, and then we can have a sensible conversation. We might still disagree, but if I missed something that changes the story, I am very happy to take it into account. This is one reason I have been as careful as I could to give chapter and verse for every assertion that I make, and why the bibliography is an important part of this work. I am grateful to Yale for reinstating it in full, as it was in the original hardback in this new edition. In science, you can be as perfunctory as you like, as long as you are saying what everyone else is saying. But if you are saying something different, you need reasonably enough to be as explicit about your evidence and as empirically based as possible. That way you are open to challenge, and that is how science progresses. Incidentally, I could have no interest whatever in a picture I had made of myself. That would mean I had not made contact with the reality outside myself, but simply created a pointless fantasy. I have sought to be true to whatever is, whatever exists. I have been impassioned to discover the picture that is already there, given in the structure of ourselves, our brains, and our minds. If I have got it wrong, and I may well have in places, it will not be because I have knowingly misrepresented the data. Many times the data have led me to change an assumption or expand a view, to reconfigure the picture and then to become aware of something I otherwise would never have seen. Anomalies are often the path to a new understanding. I have also come across some anomalies that do not outweigh the other evidence available in the field. Every scientist has this to contend with, especially in the life sciences, where there will never be 100% agreement on anything. The question must always be then, does an aberrant finding force a rethink, or would that be to lose a grip on what the rest of the findings suggest? And so in writing the book, I drew on a vast body of literature. Not even a team of researchers could easily have provided a comprehensive review detailing every single study in just one part of it, unless that part were fairly limited. Never mind across the whole field. To be fair, no one has suggested I should have drawn on more literature, and some kind of selection is agreed to be inevitable. The question then becomes how unrepresentative are the inevitably incomplete data. When it comes to the human brain, things are rarely, if ever, cut and dried, and people will differ in what they would have chosen to emphasize. However, I have tried always to be true to an emerging consensus in any one area, though no consensus is ever absolute, and where there was considerable support for an opposing view, I indicated it. Originally, such moments of qualification were in the text itself, but my editor wisely thought that I should put the most such excursus into the endnotes, for fear of the reader losing the thread of the argument. I think this was good advice. I have carried on reading and discussing with colleagues for a further 10 years, and nothing I have read leads me to change the substance, or even accept in one or two small points the detail of what I wrote. New evidence continues to fit with the hypothesis. None of the many pieces of evidence can be by itself conclusive, but their convergence across a variety of aspects of human psychology has become increasingly persuasive. Much of this material is incorporated in my current writing, in which I am providing, at least in certain limited areas, which is all that can be humanely achieved, a more nearly comprehensive review of the literature. Is there a value in trying to view hemisphere difference not just as a mass of unrelated technical details, but as a coherent picture at the level of human meaning? This seems to me the important question. To sustain any coherent vision requires one to make an attempt to span fields of knowledge, and as human knowledge expands exponentially, the task becomes ipso facto more difficult. Should we therefore abandon the attempt? Certainly, we must conclude that attempting such a synthesis is something that scientists with respectably constrained vision can from now on never attempt. However, with luck, some will be foolhardily enough to try, since the constrained vision is not, absolutely not, a feature of science, but of the nature of the contemporary science establishment. As no less a figure than the great evolutionary biologist and paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, one of the founders of the so-called modern synthesis of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics, the crowning achievement of 20th century biology, wrote, "Science, truly to be such, must center not on descriptions and names, but on principles, that is, generalizations, theories, relationships, interconnections, explanations about and among the facts." And although I am not aware of having been criticized on these grounds, I should forestall a possible misunderstanding. I could understand someone reasonably enough expressing the view that this is a hypothesis that cannot be falsified. That is, however, not the case. While it cannot be falsified by any one experiment, and can certainly be falsified, parts of it could be more easily falsified than the whole, but even the whole could be falsified.